Create bodies and components. In this video, we'll create a body and component, and we'll demonstrate how to convert a body to a component. In Fusion 360, we want to get started with the supplied dataset, bodies and components. Inside this design, we have a sketches folder that contains a single sketch with 3 center diameter circles. Noticing that in this design, at the very top level, the icon next to bodies and components is a single cube. This represents the top level of our design in the browser, and it also helps us identify the fact that we don't have any bodies or components in this design. As soon as we begin to turn the sketch into solid geometry, we will be able to tell based on the icon what this design contains. To get started, let's go to Create and select Extrude and select the far left center diameter circle and begin dragging it up a distance of 50 millimeters. Noting in the operation dropdown that we have both new body and new component, but we're going to keep the default new body and select OK. We're going to show sketch 1 because we will need to use it again, and now we have a bodies folder that we can expand which contains a single body. At the top level, you'll note that we still have just a cube icon. This is telling us that this design does not contain any components, but we can see on the screen that we now have a body because we have a bodies folder and it does contain a single solid body. Let's repeat this process by selecting Extrude, grabbing the second center diameter circle and dragging this one up 50 millimeters. But this time the operation will select New Component and OK. Noting now that the icon has changed to a small grouping of cubes. This tells us that the design contains components. Then you can see in our browser that we have a single component, component 1. There's also a radio button next to it, and inside of our timeline we have a component cube, and then we have our extrude feature. What we've done at this point is we've taken a sketch that was created at the top level of our design, and during the creation of a solid body, we've turned it into a component. This means that the sketch still resides at the top level, but any features created or modifications done to that body will now reside at that component level. For example, if we select Modify and we fillet this top edge, we'll select OK. Note that the fillet is placed in the timeline after this. But if we go to our components and we activate our component, note that we only see the extrude as well as the fillet. And that's because these creations or modifications were done to a body inside of a component. This means that it contains that information and it helps us downstream in various different ways. Let's activate the top level and let's explore something else that we can do. We can go to Assemble and we can create a new component. We can name it at this point. We can determine its type, for example, if it's standard or sheet metal. We can make it internal to the current design or save it externally. We can also create it from existing solid bodies, or we can create it as a new empty component. The parent will be the current active component, and this is going to be the top level of our design. We'll say OK, and now we've created a secondary component. Notice all the other bodies and components in this design have changed opacity. This helps us focus our attention on the component we're currently editing. I'm going to temporarily hide sketch 1, and I want to create a new sketch. I'm going to select one of the sketch planes and use my center diameter circle and simply place it off to the side and finish the sketch. We'll use Extrude and we'll drag this larger circle up, creating a 50 millimeter cylinder. Noting that in the timeline we have our sketch and we have the feature that we use to create our solid body, in this case an extrude. It's important to note that we're only seeing the sketches and features used inside of this component when it's active. But if we go back to the top level once more, we can see not only those sketches and features, but we can also see everything else in this design. Using the component methodology allows us to maintain a consistent timeline, and it helps us identify features and sketches that were used for specific components. There's a little bit more to it than that, so let's explore just a few more differences. If we expand component 2, note that it has its own bodies and its own sketches folder. If we expand component 1, notice it only has a bodies folder. That's because it was created after the sketch was created, and it was created during our extrude. Another important thing to note is the existence of an origin. The origin is created in reference to the original or top level design. This means that as we're looking at this design, Fusion 360 wants to make note of the location and orientation of its coordinate system of all subcomponents. We can capture its position, or we can revert it back to its original. With a body, we're not able to simply drag and move them around, but with components we can move them around, we can apply mechanical motion joints, and we can even say whether or not they're rigid or fixed in place. For example, if we revert and we go to our component, we can right-click and ground it. When we ground it, we place a pin icon in the timeline, and what we're telling Fusion 360 is that the location of this component is fixed in space and we can no longer move it or drag it around. But component 2 is free to move about. There are many differences and nuances between creating bodies and components, but it's important to note that anytime mechanical motion is required, an exploded view is created, or detailed drawings that have parts lists, it's a good idea to make sure that you're creating components and that you're working inside of those individual components because of the downstream functionality. It's also important to note that creating components early in a design can simplify the organization of your browser and your timeline. There are other tools, such as Inspect Component Color Cycling, that allow us to quickly and easily see color coding based on the creation of various sketches and features in both the timeline, the browser, as well as the appearance of the components on the screen. So if we're quickly and easily trying to identify this green cylinder, by selecting it, we can see the base feature that was created at the top level of our design. We can see any sketches or features that were used to create its geometry, and we can also identify its location in the browser. For a design that only contains two components, this may seem negligible. But once your design and your browser become rather large and complicated, it'll start to go off the screen and you'll begin to scroll back and forth. And having this colorization as well as the organization that comes with components can make your designs much easier to work with. I'm going to go back to Inspect and toggle off Component Color Cycling. I'm going to expand Component 2. I'm going to hide the body and hide the origin. And I want to show one more aspect of creating a new component. Component 2 was created by creating a new empty component. Component 1 was created by extruding using the operation option, new component. But the body that's contained at the top level was simply extruded. There is another option that we have to convert a body to a component after the fact. So we can right-click on Body 1 and select Create Components from Bodies. Now, this has been turned into a component. It contains its own origin, it has its own bodies folder, and it can be activated, meaning that any new sketches or features that are used will be contained within that sub-timeline. I'm going to activate the top level. I'm going to revert its position, and I want to go ahead and save this design before moving on.